All right. Welcome to the A's Philosophy YouTube channel. I am A's Philosophy, and I was hoping to get a discussion going. Um, some people may have seen that I had this originally being scheduled for earlier this evening, evening where I am. But unfortunately, there was a gigantic thunderstorm where I live, and the power went out. And obviously that was wreaking havoc on my internet connection and stuff. So I had to shut things down, but we are back. The lights are back on, everything's back on for now. Hopefully it stays that way. But unfortunately, yeah, I think I had set up the stream to be uh, started about an hour ago, and I think possibly some people had seen that and were looking for that. But now that I had to basically delay things, we'll try and get something going. We'll see if anyone stops by. Um, but yeah, that was the issue. For anyone who saw the earlier stream and was wondering why it got canceled, it's because my power went out due to a very severe and massive thunderstorm in my area, which has passed by me now. So yeah, uh, again, the idea, hopefully, if there's anyone out there who wants to have a discussion, topics are in the title description: existence of God, religion. We'll talk about societal issues if people want. There's a lot of that to be discussed. I'm basically just trying to get the truth. I've seen. We can also look at some of the other things in the meantime if we're waiting for someone. I'll post the link. There's the link. Again, I probably won't be able to go as long tonight just because of how horribly things were delayed by the thunderstorm and the power going out, and this how I was hoping to start over an hour ago, but just wasn't able to do so. But if somebody has any issues or topics, I've obviously been watching other channels, which is what I usually do in my free time. That's not obviously the only thing I do, but basically what I do. I got Von Eric. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. Mine I mainly focus on it when I mean, just like everyone, the algorithm pushes things to you, and I'll watch them. It could be any number of different topics. But for me, watching basically Christian theological channels and skeptical channels. And I was watching one skeptical channel today with, one of these, a channel very similar to mine, in that people are invited to have discussions on the channel, and the premise of all of this is that basically the arguments of the hosts are that, and these are statements that are made as a matter of fact. It's basically, what did I see? God does not exist. Evolution is a fact. The Earth is not flat. Okay, I can agree with that. Was one that I saw. What else did I see? Shoot, I probably should have. Let's see if I can go find it real fast. Yeah, but basically, for anyone out there, for the skeptics out there, for you to make the claim that God does not exist, for people to make that claim, I think is one of the most bizarre statements that I mean, it strikes me as so just, I don't know what the word is, prideful, arrogant. Maybe those aren't the right words, but just with everything we don't know about the universe and how it came to be, I think these people have a very inflated belief about what science has actually demonstrated and what it's actually proven. I really do think a lot of these people think that science has basically proven how the universe came into existence. They think science has proven answered basically all the large questions about how life came to be and how everything functions, including life itself. And I just look at things, and I do study these things, and I have someone who's studied science as part of my basically as part of my education. I mean, and I'm talking continuing education. And the thing is, a lot of people don't realize, a lot of lay people especially, and even a lot of scientists, we really don't understand, even at a very basic level, almost anything about the universe. Now we have observed more today at this time than we did in the past, and therefore we do know more things than we did in the past. Good to see you, Andy. The problem is this, and actually, I had a college professor who when I was in undergrad, this guy, I don't know if he was religious or not. He probably wasn't. When I say religious, I don't mean just like an adherent of a specific religion, but even I don't know if he believed in God. I don't know if he had any spiritual belief whatsoever. But he was in the hard sciences. He was someone who was someone who was not only a scientist, but someone who worked in applied science, which means taking scientific knowledge and actually using it to develop technology and things like that. He was a very good professor. And I remember one day he stood up and asked the question, why do electrons flow from negative to positive? Now, negative and positive are just conventions that we use to describe the direction of the flow. And this was a class of probably 50 people, college undergrads in the sciences, who had been studying. This was toward the end of the studies. So we'd all been studying these things for a long time. And he just asked this very simple question: why do electrons flow from negative to positive? And it was like, well, that's just because what they do. I mean, because people were giving answers and this and that, but no one gave the correct answer according to him. And we were all like discussing the ideas. We were all discussing, well, because of this, because of the field, there's an electromagnetic field, and it pushes the electron in a certain direction according to, the charges of the particles and things like that. And at the end of it all, he actually just stood up and said, actually, we have no idea why electrons flow from positive to negative. And we were like, what? No, yeah, we know everything about it. He's like, no, we don't. We just observe it happening. And we have no idea. Like, if we wanted to change the nature of an electron to not do that, we couldn't do it. We just see them doing it. We don't know how it happens. We don't know why it happens. We just observe it. And by observe, we obviously don't see electrons. We measure the flow of electrons, and we have microscopes. We can't actually directly observe them. We observe them by indirect means. That we have, electron microscopes that can basically provide glimpses of these extremely tiny particles and what their nature is and things like that. But anyway, when I say observe, I don't obviously mean it in the indirect sense. But anyways, we observe. We know that the electrons do this. We see them not obviously, again, indirectly. So they're doing this, and but the point is they just do it. But no one can explain why they do it. It's just kind of what they do. It's just their nature to do it. And it's the same with all the elementary particles of the universe. They just kind of do this thing. And we can see them doing it indirectly. We can measure them. We can, yes, make these observations. And it's the same with the speed of light. We can measure it. We don't know why these particles are moving this way, or how it came to be that they were attained or ascertained, or this nature of theirs was determined. But because of our measurement capacities, we have gained the ability to observe these things doing things, whereas in the past we couldn't. So a lot of people think that because we can observe more than were able to in the past, that means we've explained how these things happen. And that's not the case at all. The fact is we have absolutely no clue why these things are doing these things, why these particles have this nature, these laws of nature, these physics, these constants of these equations and things like that. We don't know why it happens. We don't know where they came from. I was on a panel of atheists the other day, and some of them were postgrads in physics. And I had this very same conversation with them. And this very same concept came up. And I said, what would happen if an electron, so what is an electron? And they said, oh, it's a particle with a charge of -1. And I said, what if the electron didn't have a charge of -1? What if it had a charge of plus 0.5? And by the way, basically protons have a charge of +1 and electrons have a charge of -1. Again, these are conventions, which means they have an equal but opposite charge, which means they perfectly balance each other out. And I said to myself, I asked them, well, what if an electron didn't have a charge of -1, and what if it was like plus 0.5? And then they said, well, the universe would literally explode because there'd be no ability for matter to coalesce, and because the electrons and protons attracting each other is what causes atoms to form. And if they were both of the particles had the same charge, the similar charges repel, so the whole universe would literally disintegrate. And I said, wow, well, isn't it convenient that somehow, some way, the Big Bang just magically produced these two different particles that have the exact same opposite charge from one another, so the universe could be perfectly balanced with matter and everything? What about the beginning of the universe guarantees that these two opposite but equally strength charged particles would exist to cancel each other out and form matter? There's nothing we know of that suggests that protons and electrons would have to exist in the same universe at the same time with an opposite but equal charge. And I don't think people understand what a massive coincidence, because again, think about it. What if there were no electrons? What about our universe necessitates that electrons exist? Nothing as far as we know, yet there they are. And if they didn't exist, well, then matter couldn't form because protons would have nothing to attract to form atoms, and they would just be repelling each other eternally through in an ever-expanding void. So the fact that electrons exist and they have the exact same, perhaps the laws of physics underwent a sort of evolutionary process. Well, that's an interesting idea, but there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of this evolutionary process in physics whereby particles underwent some sort of mutational process where they gradually achieve the charges they do now. There's simply, and I know you've brought this up before, Andy, about how in the beginning of the universe, quote unquote, scientists do say, oh yeah, I know you're speculating. I'm not, and I'm just kind of, because this is technically an open discussion, I'm just kind of reacting to your speculation, which is an interesting thought. I'm not trying to be hostile in any way. I think it's an interesting notion. My counter to that would be not necessarily even a counter. My reaction to that is the laws of physics as we observe them seem to be immutable. That is to say, we have measured the forces of these particles down to a very specific and exact point. Extremely exact. We can actually calculate the number of times per second that these things are vibrating within the structure of the atom. And the properties and characteristics of these elementary particles seems to be absolutely immutable. They operate on a very specific and perfect functional. They function perfectly throughout all time. They don't change, and uh, some is really amazing. You look at electromagnetic, like a lot of people like one of the things that we did in when I was in university was we studied the kind of computer programming. And one of the things that I learned at that time is that crystals are actually really essential to the functioning of computers because when you're trying to send the electrical signals through the entire system, you need something that vibrates at a very specific rate. And crystals actually have this property. It's called piezoelectricity. When you pass an electric charge through some of these different types of crystals, the crystal formation will vibrate at a perfect rate in a certain amount of time. So their different crystals have different properties, but this is how computers work. If you didn't have these crystals, they couldn't work because the crystals. Well, maybe there are some types of computers that work without them. But modern computers, they use these vibrating crystals within them to basically send the signals out, which gets interpreted as zeros and ones and things like that. And if these crystals didn't vibrate at this very specific rate, then the whole thing would fall apart. And you can all research that. This is all well-known science, okay? But a lot of people just don't know it. But it's there. It's there for anyone. Anyone who's studying computer science can look at, understands these things. But my whole point in all of this is when somebody is claiming that God does not exist, well, we haven't explained the most basic facts about the universe. There are a lot of things about our universe that we don't even understand, even though we're looking right at it. And we can see it happening in front of our eyes. And at the end of it all, we don't understand why these things are happening. Good to see you, Nancy, by the way. So there's nothing in science. Yeah. Watches use the same thing. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. A lot of technology uses it. Helium is an essential element in computer chips, in which a great amount of helium is generated out of the nations surrounding the Gulf of Hormuz. Okay, I did not. I actually did not know that. Okay, so yeah, but my point is, when I look at these skeptical channels, and one of their underlying premise of the topic is that God does not exist, I would like to see more something like. Just even if it was just like we believe God does not exist, or there are no good reasons to believe God exists, but to make the statement, the positive claim that God does not exist seems to me. Now they could just be doing it out of simplicity. They don't want to put in the title. The God hypothesis is less rational than the non-God hypothesis. I understand all that, but then it comes to the question of, well, what if God does exist? And you've just spent your whole life on your YouTube channel just like basically claiming that this is what I know this is Pascal's wager and all, but a lot of these people who are staking themselves on this non-God hypothesis line of argumentation, I feel like they're taking a huge risk just because there's just so much we don't know. And it seems to me very much within the realm of possibility that some God does exist. Now, is it like a God up in the sky throwing light? No. Okay. So there's the ideas of the gods up in the skies throwing lightning down and taking the sun around in the sky through the chariot with a chariot and things like that. Okay. Of course, those concepts of God have been, thoroughly falsified. Gods sending rain down. To like, or floods to punish the bad guys. Yeah, these things don't exist. But the idea of some sort of supreme mind that is the source of creation and life seems to me very much still at least still on the table. And I would say very likely. Now, getting to what exactly the full scope of this being and whether it actually cares about us or not, and all this stuff, and what its nature is obviously would have to fall within the realm of religion. But the idea that there's some sort of intelligent creator behind the universe and life seems to me right now. It seems. It's just a matter of what it is. It's not a matter. I don't doubt that this being exists. It's just like, well, what's its relationship to us? Does it actually care about us? Does it interact with us? Does it want us to do something? These are the only. I don't. But and it must, because to me, life couldn't exist without it. Again, this goes back to evolution. The second point of this person's channel that was mentioned on there, that evolution is a fact. Well, it depends on how you define evolution. A lot of times they'll try to equivocate on the term evolution. Oh, it just means change over time. How could you? Well, no one's denying that. Young Earth creationists don't deny that things change over time. Even life changes over time. Obviously, the argument is whether all life forms are related through common descent to a universal common ancestor, which would have had to have been some sort of very simple creature. And when I say creature, I mean living organism. Some sort of, well, it would have had to have started out as they say, as some sort of self-replicating molecule. But again, yes. Yes, and with the shutting down of the Strait of Hormuz, the entire global economic situation is critically affected. I would be shocked if a supreme creating entity was bothered with whether we believe that it exists or not, especially consider how difficult it is for us to know. Yeah, Andy, excuse me, Nancy, Andy, you and Andy have interacted a couple times on panels on my channel throughout, several times in the past, as far as I can remember. Maybe a couple times. I think he was on the last time you were on my channel, like a month or so ago. He was also there, and a couple other times. I think that I would be shocked if a supreme creating entity was bothered with whether they believe that it exists or not, especially consider how difficult it is for us to know. We have to ask, why is it that this, super all-powerful being that knows us and loves us doesn't really care to reveal itself to us in a way that's easy to discern? It could be with our limited understanding of what exactly this being is. Like, I heard an analogy once. Like, if you're like an ant on the back of an elephant, think about that for a second. You're just, you don't even know you're on an elephant. I mean, this is just an analogy, so it's kind of weak at some level, but just say you're a tiny little bug on that's living on a massive creature you can only see a few inches around you. So you don't really see a living creature. You just see like scaly skin, and it doesn't look like it's alive, and some hair, and you don't know what that is. It might look like a tree or whatever it is, But as the ant, let's just go with the ant. It's a tiny insect, a tiny bug. You're not going to see that you're on this elephant, okay? But nevertheless, the elephant is there, and you're looking at it. You just don't interpret it as such. I think that's the same case, kind of like how those are humans. We are actually looking at God. We just don't understand it. Like I think if we could zoom out to see the entire universe, and we understood everything about how the universe operates, and we would see that it is all part of the being of God, and that this being of God is like, there are aspects of its reality that are just beyond our perception. So it communicates through us through ways that we do understand. So I think one of the things that about this, I'm just, again, you were speculating earlier, Andy. I'm going to speculate a little bit. I think that it can communicate to the consciousness of some humans. Now, why only some humans? Again, probably because maybe only those humans are receptive to it. But again, so it communicates to us through consciousness, through mechanisms that we will perceive and understand, we can recognize. So it communicates to prophets. This is a label we give to people who are receptive to God's communication, and it tells us what it tells us what it is it wants us to know. Okay, so this would be the role of the prophets. The prophet's role is to be those who communicate with this being. Are you implying that the universe itself is potentially God? What I'm trying, that's an interesting way of phrasing it. I would say that the universe is a manifestation of God, of the essence of God. And just like, if you look at, like, think about what are humans composed of? Largely, it's a bunch of like atoms, right? But they all, if you're just like a little teeny amoeba inside a human, you have no idea. Like the bacteria in our gut, think about that. They don't know that they're inside this large being that's an entire organism that's greater than it is. They're just bacteria in a gut. But what is our body composed of? Atoms, molecules, and it all adds up to this conscious being. Okay, so what are atoms? They're almost like little. They look like little solar systems, right? They look like miniature versions of galaxies. All right, or solar systems or whatever. It's basically you have the protons and the electrons are revolving around the protons with opposite with opposite but equal charges. Okay, this is basically the structure of the entire universe. You have the atoms with the protons and electrons. You have the suns with the planets revolving around the sun, and then you have the galaxies with the stars revolving around it. Okay, so all of these things, when you look at the human level, our level that we perceive, we have all these things that have been create a conscious being. Okay, so I think if you zoom all the way out, okay, let's just try to brainstorm this, Andy. If we could zoom all the way out, we would see that the galaxies and all these things are part of like the corpus of God itself, and just like at a kind of bare matter at the human level creates a conscious being, the entire universe is matter, galaxies and things like that create a universal conscious being, and that would be God. But that consciousness would obviously be at a level that is just way beyond anything we can possibly comprehend. Like the consciousness of God would be something that is like it'd be like a worm trying to understand the consciousness of a human. It just can't comprehend it because a worm, the limitation, doesn't have senses. It doesn't have the ability to think abstractly. The consciousness of a human is incomprehensible to a worm. I think in the same way, the consciousness of God is incomprehensible to a human, but nevertheless, we can kind of relate to the fact that it does have some sort of awareness. And again, a lot of this is, I'm not going to lie, highly speculative. But to be clear, this is an idea I'm fully willing to entertain. I do often give credence to a god or a creator existing. I just think that Yahweh and the rest of the ancient gods are fictional. And I understand that, Andy. That's not an unreasonable position to hold. In fact, I think it's probably a good anchor for a belief system, a theistic belief system, where you're willing to entertain that some sort of intelligent God exists at some level that is beyond our ability to comprehend, but just that none of the religions really encapsulates that idea truthfully, and that all the human religions are kind of just man-made fictions that of us trying to explain our world. And it's that's a rational position to hold, a reasonable position to hold. But what I would say is, going back to it, I would also keep in the back of your mind that it's possible that when you look at what religion, a lot of religions are, is they give names to this God, like in Judaism or Hebrew thought, however you want to call it. They called the God Yahweh, which is, apparently Hebrew for I am that I am, or I am the self-existing one. Okay. So, Yahweh, and we've had this discussion before, so, we can cover this ground again. To me, Yahweh isn't like a name like Thor or Bob or Zeus. It's basically God describing himself, quote unquote. His basically providing an understanding of God's nature in what we should call God. So God's name in Hebrew thought is a description of God's nature. I am that I am. I am a self-existent being. So God, God is telling Moses, I know you don't believe in the Bible as real history, but let's just kind of give it the possibility that it might have been historical, something that actually happened. When God communicated to Moses, and Moses asked God, "What's your name?" God, it wasn't like, "My name's Bob." No, God. What God said is, in Hebrew terminology, I am an eternally self-existent being, or Yadhi Vadhi, I am that I am, and so that became, but Yahweh kind of turned into this kind of anthropomorphized name for God, in the same way that Zeus is the name of the Greek, God, and Thor is the name of the Norse god, and other religions had their gods. But it's possible that Yahweh, not only Yahweh, but some of these other gods, like when you think about Yahweh actually was this unimaginable intelligence that created the universe, coming down and communicating to a human and telling Moses specifically what it is that God wants Moses to let humanity know about God. And what God communicated to Moses essentially is that there's a specific way that I want you to live. And it's not necessarily that God cares about us believing in God's existence. It's that God wants us to know that there's a purpose to all this. There's a reason. There's a right way to live our lives. And God has created us not just as a random act of just whim, but God has created us to basically have a meaningful existence. Okay? And that meaningful existence is manifested through being obedient to what God considers right, good. Okay? So when we live in accordance with God's will, it's not like God, this is why the people who say that we have to believe the Trinity or we're not saved. It's like, no. Salvation is not about propositions. It's not about believing the right facts. It's not about getting things right about the nature of God. It's about living the purpose for which God made us. And you can get a whole lot of things about God's nature wrong and still do that, which is why I don't think God cares about us believing about the Trinity and whether God knows the future perfectly, all these things that people debate. I mean, there's some truth this way or that to all these arguments, but it's irrelevant. Just like our salvation isn't dependent on knowing how old the earth is. Well, the earth has a certain age. Is it 6,000 years or is it, 4 billion years? Well, somebody's right and somebody's wrong, but whoever gets that right, it doesn't matter to God. It doesn't really matter at all. What matters to God isn't getting the facts right, the propositions right, or the It's about knowing that there is this ethical truth about morality. All right. Let's see here. I'm trying to catch up on some comments. Okay. Andy and Nancy having a conversation about Michigan. Cool. The ancient gods were associated with individual natural forces. Okay, I don't agree with that. The ancient gods were associated with individual natural forces such as death, famine, drought, windstorm, sex. Even Yahweh was a war storm god in his earliest literary layers. I mean, you can see Yahweh in the Bible being portrayed as influencing the weather to basically reward or punish people depending on how they behave, sure. But that's not like the essence of how the Bible portrays God. That's an activity of God. That's not what God wants us to know about him. That's not even what and again, I remember we've had these conversations before, Andy, but something to think about. The Bible doesn't start off with God, brought rain and storms down on the bad guy, thunderstorms on the bad guys, and rain to the crops of the people. It starts off by what is the Bible want us to ultimately know? God created the heavens and the earth, so God is the creator of all things, and as part of that, God has authority over the elements. All right, so God created living things, biological organisms, and they're reproduce. Okay, so there's that. But God is, Yahweh isn't being portrayed as being very limited to a certain aspect of creation or nature. God, I think Yahweh in the Bible is being presented as the master of all things that exist on heaven and earth. And that includes all of these things. Now, that would seem to me to diverge from, yes, the pagan cult gods of the primitive nations of the world at that time, in this early, I guess, in the Stone Age, Bronze Age, whatever you have it, in that area, Mesopotamia and the Near East and the Middle East and Egypt and even in Europe and I guess elsewhere too. You do see a lot of specific gods, like even in, like, let's think about the Greeks. They had a god for literally everything. They had a god for like the summer, and this is a different one for the spring, and a different one for the fall. And they had a god of rain, and a god of wine, and a god of the sun, and a god of the moon, and a god of this and that, and a god of dreams, and a god of light, and a god of darkness, and all these different things had a different god. I really do not see Yahweh as being portrayed that way. I see Yahweh as being portrayed as the supreme creator of all things in heaven and earth, and encompasses all these things, not only relevant to one specific aspect of nature itself. Oh, this is pretty crazy. All right, so looks like I think maybe Nancy was on Attica Road in Michigan, and maybe Andy has some familiarity with that, which is pretty crazy. Hmm. When it comes to a potential God creator, I tend to lean more toward a God creating the universe and being completely unaware that we even exist because we're such an insignificant portion of the universe. Well, one thing about a God is, I think part of the aspect of God is that it's aware of all things that are taking place within the universe. So I think a lot of people want to conceive of God as like this kind of almost like human like figure that like kind of like is in this dark room, and then it kind of like snaps its fingers, and out in front of it, like like maybe like on the other side of the screen, quote unquote, like the universe pops up and it's like God's like looking at it like, yes, this is a good universe. I'm looking at it and some of it's what's going on over there. It's what's going on in the northern part of the universe. Now, I think that it's more it's that's not how it works. I think that first of all, the universe wasn't created ex nihilo. I think that everything that is in the universe is a part of God, which means that everything in the universe has existed for all time, all eternity. But everything just kind of changed its configuration. So part of what God is as this conscious being. It's just like excuse me, I'm already getting so tired. Yeah. By the way, update for everyone. I was supposed to start this stream much earlier than I did, but I had a massive thunderstorm roll through my area, which shut down the power in my house. So I started like probably over an hour later than I wanted to. So I'm not going to be able to go for as long tonight as usual. But we're having a good conversation right now. But I think that I do think that God is aware of everything that's taking place within the physical universe, which is a lot of stuff. It extends way beyond the limits of the universe are unknowable to us. We can see to the horizon of the observable universe, which is, apparently billions of light years away. How much farther it goes, I don't think anyone knows. But however far it goes, God is aware of every grain of sand on every planet in the entire universe and what that grain of sand is doing. And when I say grain of sand, that's all really just a stand-in for everything that exists. God is aware of not just of this, but of the particle. Every single particle in existence God is consciously aware of it. And so God cares about everything, and that would include humans. Now, are humans special? I would say they are as special to God as everything else is. And God cares about us. But God also cares about things going on the other side of the universe, which probably might involve living beings, like sort of like I'm gonna call them space aliens or whatever they are. I think God probably cares about them too. I think God created the universe and cares about all of it. I'm going to sound like a broken record right now, but it would do you wonders to research the origin and spread of the storm god across ancient Mesopotamia and Canaan. Yahweh would become very clear. Again, I mean, when I read the Bible, and again, people who watch my channel know that I'm not one to just sit here and says the Bible says it and therefore it's true. No. Obviously, when it comes to the modern Bible, which includes the New Testament, I explicitly reject books in the New Testament, like entire books in the New Testament. And I can see similar levels of criticism being levied against parts of the Old Testament, but I'm not as familiar with Old Testament studies as I am with New Testament. But when I look at how God is portrayed in the Old Testament or the New Testament, I don't see a storm god. Now I see a God that causes storms to happen, but I don't see like this co-option from a storm god pagan nation of Mesopotamia. I don't see the early Hebrew peoples being like, man, that storm god from Mesopotamia is really powerful. That's a bad dude right there. We're gonna take that god and we're going to soup him up, and we're going to make a really awesome storm god, and we're going to call him Yahweh. I really don't think that's what's going on. It doesn't strike me as this whole theory of the Hebrew people just basically co-opting other local storm deities who pre-existed them. That's just not the vibe I'm getting from the Bible. I don't see it as being like, but there are probably specific verses in the Bible that you can use to support that. Like I know you brought up the verse about God inheriting a portion of the land from among the other gods, things like that. So there's certainly statements in the Bible that can, but when you take it as a whole, and it's kind of like how in theological discussions, when the free gracers or the sola fide people, the faith alone, when they want to prove that Jesus taught faith alone, they'll say, look, John 3:16, whoever believes will have eternal life. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son so that whoever believes will have eternal life. Okay, yeah, if you just look at that one verse, Jesus is teaching that you have to believe and you're saved. Wow, isn't that amazing? But when you look at everything Jesus taught, it's obvious that that verse doesn't hold, that's interpretation of the word believe doesn't hold up. That believe just means believe, a small set of facts about Jesus, or put your faith in Jesus as the Savior. No, Jesus said a lot of things about salvation. Yes, he said you have to believe, but he also said that you have to obey God's law. So you have to incorporate all of it. In a similar way, what I would say is, yeah, okay, if you want to take verses that the Bible are in the Bible that make Yahweh look like a storm god, you can do it. They're in there. You can see God being angry and sending storms and wiping people out and things like that. But that's not all that's being said. There's other parts. That's just one aspect of the entire story. It's Yahweh is not being presented as some sort of, one natural phenomenon specific deity. Yahweh is being portrayed as the ultimate creator of all things and the God that instituted all things, including storms and everything in nature. So I don't see a storm god in Yahweh. I see that's part of what God does is control the weather and things like that. But that's just, again, I don't see it as like, man, Yahweh's just like that Sumerian god, but he just has a different name now. I don't see it. I really don't see it that way. Now, there might be more evidence, but right, but that's my point. Only in later Jewish writings did Yahweh become known as the supreme creator deity. His earliest layers were almost solely associated with typical storm deity. Well, that's a claim that I'm just gonna be totally honest here. There are probably scholars who are able to date the various portions of the Old Testament and see which ones are earlier than the others. But they would have to prove in that case that the verses which portray Yahweh as a storm god precede verses like Genesis 1:1, which portray God as the supreme creator of all things. And to me, that would be a very tall task. Now, I'm not saying it hasn't been done. All I'm saying is I can't even imagine how they would go about doing that with the evidence available. But maybe they know more evidence that, that's their job, is to study these things. So maybe I'm not ruling it out as a possibility, but it would seem to me like a very difficult thing to prove. Yeah, I think I pinned the link earlier, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, anyone who wants to join is able to. If you want to join, certainly. I think I got to click the link. I was going to review some videos, but I can do that some other time, really. I was going to review a video of Bart Ehrman, how do you Bart? How do you pronounce his name? Probably not pronouncing his name correctly. I've heard it 1,000 times, but anyways. All right, Andy, how you doing?
I'm still kicking.
Good,
Oh,
good.
I
Set
don't even
scales.
know where to start. Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Hello.
yeah.
So,
Just set scales. I'm gonna just basically. I brought up Andy to we've had conversations before, and I think this has been an interesting conversation so far. So I was gonna let Andy roll, but yeah, actually, set scales. If you have some thoughts along the same along in this vein of conversation, feel free to chime in. But go ahead, Andy. Go start wherever you feel is appropriate.
well, so I think that the best place to start is at the beginning of where we start to see these elements of the storm god. So, and and it kind of begins in Mesopotamia as far as written records go. So it starts out with the storm god Ishkur, and Ishkur is the storm god, obviously, and he is syncretized with the Canaanite. So Ishkur is the Mesopotamian storm god, and the Semitic storm god, which is the same exact deity, is called Hadad or Adad. And they were eventually syncretized to become Ishkur Adad as one being. They were recognized by each other's nations to be the same deity. And the storm god was associated with mountains, bulls, um, storms, obviously. I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. Um, anyway, that's not really that important.
Order, they were associated with order typically.
What the storm god was?
Well, I guess it would depend on the context. Set is a storm god, and he would, I guess, be associated with chaos, but Zeus would also be like a storm god, and he's associated with order. So,
Yeah, you're right on both of those things. But to be fair, Set wasn't associated with storms until after the Hyksos took over in Egypt, which was like 1500 BCE. I'm talking more like
yes.
2500 BCE, like 1,000 years prior to that. And Zeus would have been like around 1200 BCE or something that we start to get notions of him being related to as like the storm god. But way before that, it was just Hadad and Ishkur, and they were the storm god across before Greek writings even existed and before Set was ever associated with storms, because originally Seth was just associated with like the desert and foreign nations and stuff. He was never originally associated with storms.
Yeah,
But
yeah, you're right. You're right. But before, I'm honestly not familiar with the gods you named, but I'm pretty sure before him, the god of the sky in general would have been Anu.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Anu literally translates to sky, and Enlil translates to wind, and the god Hadad was kind of like a fusion of those two elements, or Iskur, I guess, for Sumerians and Akkadians and Babylonians, it would have been Iskur. And then as the Akkadians and the Amorites moved in and took over, the Semitic groups took over Mesopotamia, they brought Adad with them, which was their version of the storm god, and they were unified to become Ishkur Adad. And that spread like wildfire as the storm, because if you ever read the Eridu Genesis or Atrahasis or even the Enuma Elish, which I'm sure you've read these before, Hadad makes a cameo as the storm god, and he's the one that brings about the flood. He brings about the rain and stuff like that. He comes down from the mountains. He's associated with the Zagros mountains. And so this was like the storm god throughout the land, all the way from the Mediterranean all the way to modern day Iran, or where the Persians were. That whole entire swath of land, they all had the same storm deity, just under a couple different names, but they all shared the exact same highly specific elements about them. And so Yahweh, like in writing, doesn't even appear until 800 BCE or something for the first time, 850 roughly, in the Mesha stele. That's the first time we see any notion of Yahweh appearing. And when Yahweh does first appear, like in his oldest layers, and this is again something I can't really substantiate as good as other scholars can, like how to differentiate which layers of the Bible are the oldest. But according to scholars, in the earliest layers, like in all of the songs, like the Song of Moses and the Song of the Sea and the Song of Deborah and stuff like that, Yahweh is strictly a storm god. He just holds these same elements that the Ishkur and Adad held, and later on Zeus. And this happened because the spread of these stories like Atrahasis and Eridu Genesis and the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so in the Ugaritic texts, so Ugarit is like a port city on the Mediterranean north of Israel, north of Tyre, north of Byblos and Sidon. In the Ugaritic text, there's Hadad. He's the primary god there, and El across ancient Canaan. El is basically like Enlil. El is the Semitic Canaanite version of the Sumerian god Enlil, and he was the creator deity. Even though in Mesopotamian mythology there was, Apsu and Tiamat were the creators, but in Canaanite mythology they had a different order. And so in Canaanite mythology, El was the supreme creator deity, and he was the father of all the other gods, and Yahweh was one of his children. Of course, this is once it reaches Judaism. But so before Yahweh, it was Baal Hadad. Baal just means Lord in this context, so we can just call him Hadad. But in the Ugaritic texts, we have Hadad, and Hadad is the storm deity, and El is the creator deity. And Hadad goes through a series of battles against chaotic forces, and eventually, he defeats the seven-headed sea serpent, just like Yahweh defeats the seven-headed sea serpent with lightning weaponry, just like Yahweh defeats Leviathan with lightning weaponry. And anyway, he eventually rises to kingship and takes on the same epithet that Yahweh takes on later in Jewish mythology, which is Elyon, or Leon, which means the Most High. So when you see El Elyon is El the Most High, and which is why he was called the Most High, because he was the creator. But like I said, over time, Hadad takes on this epithet and becomes known as the Most High in the Ugaritic mythology. And as the stories begin, he's a lesser deity under the authority of El, but over time he takes El's titles. He takes El's wife. He takes everything. He takes kingship. He becomes the ruler. And the same exact thing happens with Yahweh outside of biblical literature. When we see Israelite, like Samaritan cults and stuff, and cults in Elephantine, the same exact thing is happening with Yahweh. Yahweh rises to power. Actually, this happens in the Bible. Like I said, Yahweh begins in his earliest layers in the songs and the poems, which are, they date back to the time of King David, or maybe even earlier. Yahweh is a lesser deity. He's under he's under El Elyon, which is, El the Most High. He's given, and you were just mentioning this in Deuteronomy 32. He's given the land of Israel as an inheritance from El, the God Most High. But later on, you see in the Bible Yahweh being referred to as Yahweh Elyon, even though it was prior to him that El Elyon was the one that gave him the nation. So he's one of the sons of God, one of the members of the divine council, one of the 70 other lesser gods, Yahweh was. But then later he takes on that epithet, just like Hadad did in the Ugaritic pantheon, and becomes Yahweh Elyon, or Yahweh the Most High. So he began as a lesser deity and rose to the seat of power and became known as the God Most High. And he takes the wife of El, which was Asherah. And of course, not in the Bible. Asherah is condemned in the Bible, but outside of the Bible, in Israelite writings and in Israelite inscriptions, Yahweh is depicted as having Asherah as his wife in several places. There's actually an inscription at Kuntalit Ajrud where it's a picture of Yahweh with a female deity, and it says Yahweh and his Asherah. So she's like a consort deity. So these same things that happened with Hadad in the Ugaritic pantheon eventually happened to Yahweh. And so this is why I say that Yahweh began as like a lesser storm deity and over time became known as a supreme deity, because it's not until after post-exilic, like when I say exilic, I mean Babylonian exile. It's not until after the Babylonian exile in Jewish writings that Yahweh is being given these epithets of Most High or the Creator and things like that. In the earliest layers, none of this stuff was ever attributed to him.
Can I just talk about, the political and social implications of naming one god to now be the supreme ruler over the pantheon, because it gives whoever the priest class is who's naming this god and claiming that they're the one taking over a whole lot of power if people buy into it. And then they can basically kind of direct nations from there based off the authority that people believe they now have.
Yep, you're exactly correct. And that's because Yahweh was a local deity for Judah. Judah seems to be like the earliest place that Yahweh emerges as a god. And these priests, like as you mentioned, they're trying to consolidate power for themselves. There's actually a really good book, and it's called Who Wrote the Bible? It's kind of an older book now. It's like 30 years old. It's written by Richard Elliott Friedman, but he gives a lot of insight into these things. He sort of pulls apart certain pieces and shows you, it would take me a long time to get into it, but he covers exactly what you're saying with these Levitical priests trying to consolidate power in Judah by transforming Yahweh from a storm deity into the highest god of the pantheon, even though in the earliest layers of the Bible, El is the highest god in the pantheon and Yahweh is a lesser god. But yeah, you were spot on with that. That's exactly why this happened.
I don't think that giving God a name really, to me, to be the name Yahweh, saying it's again, it's not like Thor or Zeus. It's just a description of the nature of God. So these priests call God I am that I am. I don't see that as consolidating of power. I think also another thing about these priests is, of course,
well, hold on, just really quick. It's not the I am that I am part that it was what they were using to consolidate power. And a lot of scholars are starting to debate whether or not that's what Yahweh actually means. A lot of scholars are starting to think that Yahweh means he who breathes or he who blows, like the wind. You know what I mean? It's the epithet that they put onto his name. It's the Elion part that they add to his name, Yahweh Elion, which means Elion means Most High. That's the part that they're using to consolidate power in Judah.
Well, the one thing I'll say is that, I've seen. It wasn't you, Andy, but there was somebody I was watching. I don't know if it was Myth Vision or it probably was Myth Vision who was presenting aspects of what it is you're claiming. And it wasn't that long ago. It might have been another channel, but anyways, some of it, what I didn't see, okay, so the stuff about Asherah, if I remember correctly, they find Yahweh with this female, accomplice on like pottery shards and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, sure, there could be some random person out there who thought it would be cool to put, But that doesn't mean that that's the official narrative that's being presented by even the religious authorities. That's just somebody out there who might have just been like, I want to give God a wife. I'm going to paint him with his wife, Asherah. You know, it's like, who painted this? What was their authority? What were they? You know, so some of this is some of the evidence that to definitively tie Yahweh to these pre-existent Canaanite and Sumerian deities. I mean, again, it's within the realm of possibility, but also it's very difficult to do. Absolutely. But I'd have to look at it again and see. I do, you know, whenever I have these conversations with you, I want to review all that, because to me, the reason I probably don't as much is because my personal faith isn't contingent upon like the Old Testament being true. Like even if everything you just said was you know there was a book and everything was presented out and the facts were indisputable and I was just like, yep, this is what happened. Like I would still believe in Yahweh. I would still believe in Christ and God in general. Because to me, you know, my personal faith in God doesn't come from believing in a specific text. It comes from philosophical, you know, observations of reality. And I see aspects of that being reflected in the Old Testament text. Now, if I was an evangelical fundamentalist, yes, my entire worldview would collapse and I'd have to start over again. But for me personally, it's like, okay, some aspects of the Yahweh narrative were perhaps, you know, co-opted from other cultures and narratives about God and things, but that ultimately that doesn't influence my view about God in general, or even Jesus Christ and the truth of his ministry. Because I think that even if the Bible is just, and I'm not saying I believe this, I'm just speculating. Even if the Bible is Old Testament is just a myth, I think that when Jesus teaches according to it, he would be aware of that, but he's still teaching it to people who think that it's real. So he has to operate in that paradigm. So when you hear Jesus saying things like, just like it was in the days of Noah, they were drinking and marrying and have fun, and then the flood came and wiped them all out. I've heard apologists say like, oh, that means Jesus believes in that all of this is literal history. Not necessarily. Just like someone can say like, oh, that's like that time when Gandalf, you know, took the Ring of Power and saved it from. You know, you can say these things and not believe they're literal history. And it's the same way Jesus can point back to things that he knows are mythological and use them to make a didactic point. But again, I'm not even saying I agree that they're not true. I'm just saying, even hypothetically, even if it is all mythology, it doesn't affect the truth of Christianity, in my opinion. But so that's and that goes back to explaining why I sometimes delay in researching these things and trying to figure out how true it is exactly. How much can these anthropologists and historians actually say with definitive knowledge that Yahweh is a co-option of Ishkor and Adad and things like this? I just haven't, and this is my fault. I haven't actually seen the actual like chain of custody, if you want to call it that, from these are the Hebrew people, they're reading these myths, they're writing about them, and then they're taking these ideas and co-opting them. Like, I don't know if but you probably have seen a lot of that. So that's why I remained open to the idea that you could be entirely correct. I don't deny that you could be correct.
I want to say that generally I agree with you, Ace, that none of this disproves God, or none of it even disproves the way that Jesus lived and the example he set for people to live by. All it shows is that people use divine concepts to gain power.
Well,
I don't think that the purpose. See, here's the thing. There are people who use defining concepts to consolidate power. There's no question about that. But I don't think that was the original intent of any of this, personally. Okay. I think that that's something that happened afterwards. I think that, the religion was started by good people, and then the bad people moved in and used it, just like they use the truth to their advantage. Okay. So I see the priestly. It's just like what happened in the New Testament period, like with the Catholic Church. Like Jesus started something that was good and true and based on true divine revelation, and the Catholic Church came in and totally turned it into a human institution where you have to go through them to receive salvation, and you have to donate all the money to them, and they have all the power to absolve you of sin and things like that. Yeah, that absolutely did happen. But again, you're talking about developments that came afterwards. This wasn't, and I think that same thing probably played out in the Old Testament too. You probably had people in the Old Testament period, writing these things down, writing the prophets, people writing down the revelations from God, and then a priestly caste came along and consolidated power for themselves and did these things and changed some things to make themselves seem like the ultimate authority, things like that. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you that there are those who did those things. I just don't see that as the original intent, which I think is what you're trying to say has happened. Is what happened.
I'm trying to say, well, they did do that, but I'm just trying to say that none of this invalidates God. There's still a higher power than man that can say things. That's the point I'm trying to make.
That's I'm not even disputing that. I think that there could. I said this earlier that I think that there could be a God, and that there could be a creator, but I don't think that it's the God of the Bible, if there is one. I think that the concept of a God on earth, like that we have written about in ancient history, if there is a God in the universe that's a creator, the concept of gods in the ancient world is a total coincidence to that. It's not even related. The only reason that if you look in our earliest writings in Mesopotamia, gods are just merely a personification of natural forces. They're not act like they were like Anu was literally the sky, and like Tiamat literally was salt water. Absu literally was fresh water. Mat literally is death. They were just personifying these natural forces, and over time they become so personified that they have this rich personality to where we view them as like a human entity almost. But that's not how they began. And when you see the storm god, which is just Hadad and Ishkur was literally a personification of storms happening in Mesopotamia, and you see these very specific elements, and then you see the Jewish literature popping up and adopting all of these specific elements about the storm deity and applying them to Yahweh, and his whole sole role in the earliest parts of the pre-exilic writings, the pre-prophetic writings, even just the poetry and songs, he's just holding these specific elements that the storm deity was being applied to. My point is that the God of the Bible, Yahweh, not El, but Yahweh, seems to just, assuming that Ishkur and Hadad were just fictional because they were just, these are people that didn't know why storms were happening. They don't know why lightning shoots out of the sky and tornadoes come and rip everything apart and things like that. They have no idea why that's happening. They're not meteorologists, so that they're just coming up with explanations for these things without any basis in it. And so that's how you get the concept of a storm deity coming from the personification of storms. And Yahweh in the Bible is adopting these same elements that they're using in Mesopotamia, just in like a slightly more advanced form. And that's why I think that Yahweh is fictional. The question of a God is wide open. I'm not even disputing that. I totally think there could be a creator. I don't dispute that at all. I mean, the existence of the universe itself is crazier to me than the concept of the universe being created by something. But Yahweh himself, I do think is fictional. And I think that Jesus is talking about Yahweh when he's talking about the God of the Bible. That's the God he's talking about. So being so convinced that Yahweh is just this continuation that had, quite frankly, everyone picked up on. Like you said, Set adopted this same concept in Egypt. Zeus adopted it. We have Teshub adopting it in Anatolia. Indra adopting it in India and stuff like that. Everyone adopted the same concept as it spread out from Mesopotamia. And the Jews did the exact same thing that everybody else was doing with Yahweh. And so that's why I think that Yahweh is a fictional deity. And like I said, Jesus believes that this deity, which I think is fictional, was the one and true God, which is why I don't believe the New Testament either.
One thing I talk about
Well,
on. Yeah, go ahead,
Go ahead.
Ace. All right. Well,
I guess what I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You go ahead, Setscale. I have thoughts, but yeah, you give your thoughts. Go ahead.
well, I just want to comment on why I think that the Jews and their narrative ended up reigning supreme. Hold on, I'm gonna plug
Well, I
my
mean,
phone.
before you do that, okay, so that's kind of a different line of thought. I kind of want to.
Well, it actually
I-
it does relate to Mesopotamia, and it relates to basically why or how cultures use the gods to gain power for themselves, rooted in a biblical story.
Well, no one's. The thing is, no, I'm not denying. I don't think anyone denies that people have done that in the past. So that's obviously something people will use true ideas, such as the existence of God, but also they're easily able to manipulate, make them seem like even today. Look around at all the televangelists telling people, "Yo, God wants you to send me $50,000 so I can buy a yacht, so I can sail around and preach to the people do this. Like, there's no question. Countless people have done this throughout history. So the fact that people were doing it,
it's not necessarily out of malice that they're doing this. It's more of like it's like a war strategy or tactic that they adopt and counter their opponent with. Because, on my channel, I point out that the Tower of Babel is a real story based in historical facts that was made an allegory in the Bible by the people who were captive in Neo-Babylon. And they're describing the period from the time of Sargon to the time of Hammurabi, about a 400-year period in like one chapter. And what was going on was that these people basically during this time period, they are using writing and standardized systems to control everyone. And this is the common language. It's the language of the authority figures. They're doing things like making common weights during the period with kings like Namu and his son Shulgi. So common weights just basically means that like the scales that they used to weigh things, which were like I think they weighed in shekels and cubits. Now all the scales of all the cities were going to be tuned according to the city of the central city, or whatever city they tuned it to. Because before, like the city of Lagash, would have one shekel be different than the city of Kish or something like that. But now they're all going to conform to one system. And it climaxed with Hammurabi when he made Hammurabi's code and also built the towers that the Tower of Babel story is based on in the tower at Babylon, which I think would have been called Edamananke during his time, and a tower at Borsippa. And basically, they just used their written law codes to tell the fellow aristocrats of the other city states what to do and how to send manpower, while everyone else who would have everyone would have had diverse dialects. They would have been totally at the mercy of whatever is written on the cuneiform tablet that tells them what to do, that they can't read, that they're mostly dependent on the authority figure to read for them. So by the time you get to Neo-Babylon during Nebuchadnezzar time, so Hammurabi's during about 1800 BC to 1750 BC. Nebuchadnezzar is about 550 BC or 600 BC to 550 BC. And the Neo-Babylonians are trying the exact same playbook that the ancient Babylonians and Mesopotamians were trying. They're trying to use a written language to make everyone conform to their system. But there's a problem now, and that's that people have had time to learn cuneiform. Now, not everyone is illiterate. And so what happens is the Jews who are captive in Babylon, they start to understand the Babylonian myths better than the Babylonians. And they come up with better, more effective mythology that people believe. And it's even reflected in the Bible, because you have what was the one? The dude who interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams better than he's the one in Babylon. Daniel. Yeah, I thought it was Daniel. I just couldn't remember. But, he's interpreting the dreams better than the priests are. And this is because the Jews captive in Babylon are reading the myths for themselves and writing their own myths more effectively than the Babylonians are.
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. And I agree about Edamananke. I think that was what the Tower of Babel story was based upon. Hello, Nancy.
Hey.
Hello.
Well, here's the thing. So, as much as we talk, as I just talked about how there are. Good to see you, Nancy. There are fakers out there, people who try to manipulate people with God. I do believe that there are those who are legit. Okay, so I think a big part of Judaism, including into the Old Testament time, is the fact that there was an ongoing line of real prophets. And what is a real prophet? A real prophet is someone who is actually in communication with God. All right. So when you look at if you want to put the stuff in the Tanakh to the side for a second, which, is kind of unfair, but let's just say that for now. You do have, you have Isaiah, you have Jeremiah, you have Ezekiel. Okay, so a lot of people want to have questions about Daniel, but there are other minor prophets. So these are people who are claiming, at the very least, that they are in communion with God. Okay, Samuel. Okay, he's part of the Old Testament. He's part of that layer that I guess you all would consider mythological in nature with King David and all that. But these are people who were actually, continually in communication with God. And Jesus also, let's be honest, he claimed that he was having direct revelation from God. He didn't get his information from himself. He got it from God. So when it comes to that element of it and that elements of Yahweh, and I do think that there is a kind of line of transmission that even if you don't want to say the entire historical narrative is fact and actual history, there is an element of there are people of that tradition who are claiming that they are receiving direct revelation from God. It's not a matter of, oh, the ancient historians wrote down about the Tower of Babel, so that's what we're. No, it's like there are people who are still communicating with God to this very day. And even outside of the biblical context, I think that there are, in fact, people today from various walks of life who are having actual revelations from God in various forms. And maybe they don't call, in English we call that being that revealed God, but back in that time it would have been Yahweh. So I do think that even though maybe some elements of the historical narrative could be called into question, certainly the idea that the entire concept of Yahweh as being just this imaginary, figure that they call, I don't think that stands to the entire biblical narrative. You see what I'm trying to get at? What I'm trying to say ultimately is this isn't ultimately something that they're just saying was made up at a point in time and they're just rolling with it. There are people of the tradition who are saying, no, we're still talking to this being. We're still receiving revelation. God is still talking to us. And really, I think that continues to this very day. So I don't know if you have anything to say to that. Do you think there's any merit to that, Andy? Or
Well, yeah, I would say, why would we believe that they are actual prophets?
well,
There were prophets in Mesopotamia too. Like every king had a prophet working for them. The prophet was one of the highest members of their legal faction. So like the king, anytime they had questions about wars or about internal affairs, they would ask the prophet, and the prophet would either get the answer right and continue to be revered as one with God, or he would get the answer wrong and be killed. And so this is just a tradition that was carried on across Mesopotamia and Canaan. So it's to be expected that there would be prophets in Canaan and prophets in Jerusalem and prophets in Israel. But why would we believe that they're actual prophets?
If I could step in for a second here, I don't know everybody's agenda or what they believe in all of this. I mean, I'm a Bible thumper, Bible believing person myself, and I don't know, from looking at comments, I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out who believes what in the process of all of this. And I mean, how do I put this? I listen to all these comments and then I step back and I say, well, you know, who's in agreement and who's in disagreement with the Old Testament and the things that these prophets believed in? And I'm a little bit confused as to how to respond to the statements that are being made right now. I look at this in a different light, and I mean, I'm pretty much in sync with Anthony, but I don't know why people are making certain statements that they are as I review the comments, if I'm making any sense at all. I feel like
Yeah,
I'm
you
jumping in blind here.
You're talking about the comments in the live chat, right?
Well, comments in the live chat, and then listening to Andy here and not knowing what your beliefs are is questionable, or not questionable, but putting question marks in my mind as to how to respond. And I jumped in here because I see things that are being said that I'm not in agreement with. And at the same time, I mean, I'm a Bible believer and I believe in the Old Testament. And when I look at the statement that was just made previously about certain things in the Old Testament, and I'm like, wait a minute, no, I don't agree with that. So I have to reset here, and I fiddle around trying to get online here, and then I forgot what the hell I was going to say to begin with. So I apologize for that.
Were you talking about what I said about the Tower of Babel, or what Andy was saying about the storm god?
I think it was more or less about what Andy was saying. I mean, I'm not sure who's a Bible believer or who's, putting up information that says, well, this is a bunch of nonsense or whatever. And, so I'm confused here. So I jumped in and, I'm trying to reset myself to where I can answer or discuss what my beliefs are.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but as far as I believe, I think that the God of the Bible, Yahweh, is fictional. He never existed. He was just a concept that evolved over time from a storm god and slowly evolved into the only God and the creator God and the supreme deity and the
Okay.
ruler over all nations. And I think that the prophetic writings were written after events happened. So like events would happen, an army would come and take over Israel or take over Babel or take over Jerusalem or whatever. And then after that happened, they would create a prophetic writing to make it look like, oh, our prophet predicted this way before it happened to give validity to themselves. But
I
the
think
prophets, in my opinion, never predicted anything.
I'm remembering now why I jumped in here because, there's a lot of confusion about the name of Yahweh and which and what God he was. And it can be very confusing when going back to the Old Testament because the name Yahweh could be a pagan God or it could be God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as well. And I think it becomes very confusing when people start to try to discern between what is real and what's not, and what this God was. And I don't even know how to begin to explain where I'm at with that because, based on your biblical understanding or who's who and who's what, it can become very confusing. And
I,
I I think that they've transliterated or translated the name Yahweh into something that I had never heard of or thought about in the past, when it came to my belief in who the God of the Old Testament was. And I think nowadays, because of all of the computer and the internet and all the information that's going on there and flying around, is that the God of the Old Testament has somehow been translated or transliterated into something that it was never meant to be. If I can make that clear to you, because when having this discussion becomes so confusing that it's it becomes absurd.
so can I
So,
ask you a question? Are you familiar in the Old Testament when it refers to the land of Shinar?
well, Shinar, yeah,
Yeah.
I, I mean, you would have to explain what that means because that's a very broad, request that you're asking the.
Well, yeah. So the land of Shinar is actually a particular region that I'm pretty sure it says it right there in Genesis, near the Tigris and Euphrates, and I think it names a couple other rivers. And
Yeah.
here is where the first civilizations emerged that the Bible's talking about, where you get all these characters that the Bible names who come out of these civilizations, such as Abraham, for example, came from the city of Uruk.
Yes, I understand, and there's a lot of dissension and misinformation and misunderstanding when it comes to Abraham because it's like, well, he wasn't of Noah or something like that. He was just this person that all of a sudden became, converted to
But what? But
the God
but
of
would you
Israel.
agree? Would you agree though that he was born in a city?
I would say yes, definitely that Abraham came from that location in the Middle East, and he came from that society, but also,
Well, this actually would have been more near Iraq than Israel.
well, yes, and I understand that. But then when you go back, and because a lot of people say that, well, Abraham was just another, person that was not of Adam or anything of that nature. But when you go, and it's the way people translate things, that they say, well, he was just a heathen guy, and he just came out of Mesopotamia or whatever. But you have to go back to the genealogy and
Well,
realize that Abraham was not of any of there's Shem, Ham, and Japheth or whatever. Abraham actually came out of Shem, out of Noah, and he was not a heathen individual. He was living
and
in that location.
Shem was the one who fathered the people of the Middle East.
Pardon me?
And Shem was the one who fathered the people of the Middle East, according to the Bible.
Right. And
And
Abraham was
all I'm saying is that there are cities that existed in the Middle East, and Abraham came from one of these cities. And if we look to the mythologies that these cities have, they're very similar to the Bible. And because they predate the Bible, it's logical to assume that they were based off the Bible, or I'm sorry, the Bible was based off of them, especially when you consider that the Jews, the people who gave us these stories like Genesis, were held captive in Mesopotamian cities like Babylon and such,
well,
and they would have been exposed to these myths.
well, for one thing, I've known Anthony from A's Philosophy for a long time now, several years, and he's added people to his group and so forth, and him and I have talked back and forth in personal emails and so forth. But I don't know in particular what Andy here, what his beliefs are or your beliefs are. So it's a little confusing when it's like, all right, I mean, obviously I understand where Andy is coming from now. He's like, well, a lot of this is just mythology. I don't know if I'm talking with, is it Set Scales?
Yeah, so I could tell you what my worldviews are if you
Well,
want.
just let me finish for 1 second here. Is that, I'm like looking at the two of you, and I'm like, you're sort of aligned, if I'm correct, on the same mind or mindset, that you don't really agree with the biblical setting of this, and that these are all mythological types of beliefs, as to where I'm a true biblical believer, and I don't agree with a number of things in the New Testament as far as, oh gosh, Paul's writings and everything like that. And I think I can say for a fact that I agree that Anthony agrees with me that he does not believe in the epistles of Paul. However, I mean, it's like when I go back to ancient biblical history, I'm 100% a convert of the history of Israel. And it's not the history of the world. The Bible does not talk about the history of the world. The Bible talks about the history of Israel. And so we have to, as far as I'm concerned, we have to look at it at that. And there are many other civilizations that began well before Genesis and Exodus, that there were probably thousands of years that existed prior to that time frame that brought us up to Adam and Eve. Now I'll shut my mouth for a minute and let everybody else speak their piece.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good take, that there was time before Adam and Eve and things that led
And
up to it.
that's the problem. That's the problem I have with what you and Andy are kind of saying, is that it's almost kind of like the Jews or the Hebrews. I don't know what is the technical, like, historical way to refer to them, but the people who came out of the Abrahamic tradition. I know you all don't even believe in Abraham, but that whole these Canaanites who became the Hebrew people, these Palestinians, what I don't know what you want to call them.
Andy turned
But
into Mr.
what I'm
Rogers
trying,
here.
right? Andy's always having fun with his little profile picture. That's But what I'm trying to say is the Jews are put in this impossible situation where if they do communicate with God and they do give God a name, they're put in a situation where anyone can just say, well, there was all these other gods before them, and they're just taking various elements of the cultures around them and throwing them into a big soup and mixing it all together and putting it in the Bible. And it's like, how in that, okay, if that's your narrative, then there's no valid position for belief in God, because even to this day, if someone says, well, I received a revelation from God, well, no, you're just taking it from various cultures around the world and molding it in your own image and your own fashion and making up a story. It's like, well, it's just because they were gods that existed before the Hebrew people doesn't mean that they were necessarily copying these other gods or borrowing elements from them, or that's all that it is. There could be some element of that, but there also could be an element of, okay, we have people within our society who are claiming to be in communication with God, and we're going to write it down and we're going to pass it on and we're going to make a civilization out of it. So,
if I can, I have a brief fleeting thought. There's another book that's out there, and I can't think of the name of it. It's on my other computer right now, but it's an Egyptian chronology of the Bible, and it gives it from a different perspective of, how do I want to say, it completely gives a history of Egypt and their evaluation of going back to the Garden of Eden. I can't think of the name of this stupid book right now, but it's not a stupid book, but I mean, it fills in a lot of the empty gaps. I mean, it's from a perspective going back to societies that existed in unison with the Bible itself and Genesis and whatever. I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's another look at a parallel of Genesis going back way back, and I can't think of it. It's an Egyptian book. Maybe somebody can come up with the name of that. And I have to admit, these two gentlemen here that are on here, Andy and Set, they're apparently historians to some degree, that they have their own basis, which is always very interesting, and it adds a tremendous amount of knowledge and information to what we as Christians might believe or not believe.
It sounds like you're talking about Josephus's writings.
No,
Am I
I'm
wrong?
not talking about Josephus, and I wish I had. It's on my other computer, which I can't drag up right now, but it's an Egyptian format to the Bible. I can't think of it.
What I was going to say is that Josephus documents, actually, he quotes from an Egyptian historian named Manetho, and Manetho gives kind of like an alternate account of Egyptian history that's related to biblical history.
No, it's not. It's a whole compendium, and it's a historical book that I would have to, when I get done, or when we get done talking, I'll have to go in tomorrow or something. I'll pull it up on my other computer, and I'll put it in the comments below. But it's an incredible document too, that talks about historical things of the past. I don't know where it came from, but it's very informative, and it talks about the history from the beginning of the world and beginning of Abraham, or not Abraham, but Adam and Eve.
That's interesting. It sounds like you're talking about Josephus's reference to Manetho, but I could be wrong.
Nothing to do with Josephus. This is a completely different book. And
Well, it's not Josephus's book. He's referencing Manetho's writings.
No, I'm talking about something completely different. It has nothing to do with Josephus or anything that he would have talked about.
Okay.
I'll
Could I
I'll
quickly
post it in the
address
comments tomorrow.
could I address something that somebody said in the comments just really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ivern, LOL, he had mentioned earlier that, Jesus never mentions the name of Yahweh and that he only mentions the Father, and that there's no reason to think, basically, or at least he is implying that there's no reason to think that Jesus was talking about Yahweh. I couldn't disagree more. Jesus specifically said that he's talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which was Yahweh. He's referencing, prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel, and Zechariah that were visited by Yahweh. He's talking about the biblical creator of the universe. He's talking about the God that gave the laws to Moses. Those are Yahweh. We know for a fact he's talking about Yahweh.
I just thought of the name, the Colburn Bible. Have you heard of that?
Oh no, I never heard of it.
Yeah, you can download that. It's very extensive. I even haven't read the entire thing because it's like reading the Bible all over again. But it's an Egyptian source. It's called the Colburn Bible. It starts with a K. It's very
Yeah, I actually
ancient.
did a little bit of I think I did a little bit of research on that. You sent that to me, Nancy. I couldn't find any sources for its information.
I mean,
Maybe I don't know.
I don't know where it came from or how. I mean, I didn't get that deep into it, but it has a whole different drift of information in there. And it's an Egyptian source of, it goes back into the history of the world pretty much. And I mean, I know we have the Genesis flood, but at the same time, that was supposed to apparently cover the entire earth, but it couldn't have completely have covered the entire earth because there are so many historical documents that have been brought up and discovered that talk about before and after the flood by different civilizations that would suggest, I mean, how would you suggest or anything? The flood couldn't have covered the entire earth, otherwise these biblical or these references would not have survived, civilizations that still recorded the flood.
I mean, it could have the flood could have been global, but maybe it didn't go over every single like mountaintop around the world. So I was having a conversation on a Skeptical channel the other day, and I put forward the theory that when the flood happened, it could have been the result of the polar ice caps melting, several thousand years ago and rising to sea levels. But if let's just say all of the ice melted from both poles, and I've never done the math myself, but apparently it wouldn't even go up like several. It would probably go up like several hundred feet, and we have a lot of mountains go up, tens of thousands of feet. So it wouldn't. So even if it was I think it probably would have been a global. The global flood probably would have been a conjunction of the polar ice caps melting plus massive earthquakes around the globe, which would have caused the water levels to probably. It would have been like a tsunami effect. They wouldn't have been a permanent rising, but it would have been like a sort of a temporary cataclysm, which would have raised the sea levels even higher than they were at the time. Anyways, the point is, even in those scenarios, it's plausible that other groups of people would have survived. So that's kind of where I am with that.
I mean,
But what was that?
we have historical records all over the world that just contradict a total global flood. So something's up with that. And I mean, and we have historical records that go back before Adam and Eve. I mean, it's just, there was a civilization.
Do we?
God created the world in six days, or 6 days of 1,000 years apiece, or 6,000 years, or something like that. So, I mean, I'm over the fact a long time ago that, Adam and Eve were the first creatures that lived on this planet. That's nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But, I mean,
Well, I mean, I honestly don't think we have written records that go back more than a few thousand years. I mean, you
well,
could possibly say that there are human artifacts which go back
I mean,
tens of
I
thousands
don't
of
say
years.
written. I don't say written
Right.
records, but I mean, it's like there's so much evidence out there that Adam and Eve were not the first creatures, or that were created on this face of this earth. That we go back millenniums beyond.
Yeah, but Nancy, Scales, I want to address something that Andy said. Yeah, Ivern is kind of like this modern day Marcionite dispensationalist who has to do everything he can to tear the teachings of Jesus away from the Old Testament. Nothing anyone says is going to change his mind because he's emotionally committed to the idea that there's this new dispensation. He's a Paulinist through and through. He wants to tear Christianity away from its Judaistic roots and just believe what Paul taught, even though there's a lot of reasons to think that there are huge problems with that. I mean, there's on so many levels.
Anthony,
So,
who are you referring to that wants to take this away from us?
Somebody in the chat, somebody in the live chat. You probably can't see it, Nancy. I'm not sure. Depending on if you're looking on your phone,
I'm on my phone anyhow, so I can't see it.
Yeah. So Ivern is somebody who's in the chat, and I've talked about to him a number of times. He's a dispensationalist. He believes that Paul's teaching is the only teaching for the modern church age or whatever it is they teach, and that's why he has to believe that Jesus wasn't continuing the tradition of the Old Testament because I guess he doesn't want to believe that the God of the Old Testament is a God he has to worship. Basically it's just a modern reincarnation of Marcion and that whole idea, which obviously is just not even close to Christianity. It's Paulinism, it's pagan mythology, it's
Gnosticism.
Yeah, it's Gnosticism. Yeah, Paul was clearly had Gnostic influences and teachings in his writing. There's just no question. So that's who Ivern is, and it's not that I dislike Ivern. I'm just trying to describe his. The New Testament has nothing to do with Yahweh. I don't understand what. So you talk about Jesus. The Father is Yahweh. I mean, there's so many reasons that this statement is just, it almost borders on insane. I don't understand how anyone can read the Bible.
Which God does he think that when Jesus mentions Isaiah's prophecies, or he mentions the laws given to Moses, or he mentions the God of Isaac and Abraham and Jacob, which God do you think Jesus was talking about then? Because the Old Testament and pre-Jesus, pre-New Testament writings, including the Greek Septuagint, which is clearly what the apostles were using as their translation, identifies Yahweh as that God. So which God are you talking about?
I mean, I'm curious to hear his answer. I mean, but you have to understand that the New Testament to Ivern and the dispensationalists begins in like the book of Acts. So the Gospels are not the New Testament. The Gospels are the Old Testament, even though I guess the early church that gave people like Ivern the Pauline epistles kind of got it wrong and put them in the New Testament. There's so many things with what you believe. I mean, there are so many things wrong with what you believe. It's just like, it's not even close to a reasonable perspective to hold. Not even remotely close. But that's not going to stop you. I've talked to enough dispensationalists. you're going to hold on to it regardless of how much it's obvious that what you believe just can't possibly be true almost on so many levels. It's
Yeah, I agree.
totally
It's not
nonsensical.
even, it's not even defensible. Sorry.
The gospel that I question the most, though, out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is Luke. Where did this gospel
really?
I question John.
Wow, I was not expecting you to say Luke. I was expecting you to say
you would
John
say
too.
John.
Well, no, I think John is very viable as far as being a good resource, but Luke is the one that I question because Luke wrote the book, allegedly wrote the book of Acts as well. And I'm doing a lot of research on that right now as far as, apparently they were supposedly both written by the alleged person named Luke, but there is no anywhere in the New Testament, I mean, is there any information that we can gather about who this Luke character was other than,
Well, the same thing can be said of Mark. The same thing can be said about Mark. There's nothing in the New Testament that talks about Mark.
I think Mark was he was somebody that transcribed or whatever that was first hands-on with one of the apostles or something like that. But I think he was.
Yeah, you won't get that.
I think he was a scribe or something. But Luke is another character. I mean, he's like, who in the hell is he? Because he doesn't really follow along with the teachings of Jesus, although it's like there's a lot of information there. And, he supposedly wrote the book of Acts along with the fact, but it's like there's two authors there that he doesn't even reflect anything in the book of Luke, whoever wrote Acts. So that's, questionable. And the book of Acts ends abruptly with Paul going to prison in Rome. And it just ends. There's nothing more to be said about it. It's like, what the hell happened here? We don't have any answers. And it's just very strange. I mean, I sort of just put it like, well, I just pray about it and say, well, give me some information somewhere down the line and let's look into this deeper. But I don't put a whole lot of credibility in the book of Luke. I don't see it as telling the full story. And it's like Theophilus, who in the hell is Theophilus to begin with, is who Luke is writing this whole thing to. And it's like, and it was not written in the first century. It was written in the second century, somewhere between, I don't know, the beginning of the first century or the second century, beginning of the second century going on into the middle of the second century. So, I mean, it's just information, but it's all up in the air.
I do want to respond. Hold on. So let me respond to that. But first, I want to look at this. So Ivor is saying you have to read the Gospel of John. Okay. So in John chapter 1, verse 23, they're asking, who is John the Baptist? And he says, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as Isaiah the prophet said. So what John is saying here, Ivern, when you put it all together, according to your worldview, it does fall apart still, because he is the one who is proclaiming the Old Testament God's Messiah. That's what that prophecy is about. Okay, so you have Isaiah in the Old Testament talking about how John, or a forerunner, is going to come who's going to make straight the way for the paths of the Lord. And so Yahweh is the one who made that prophecy and fulfilled it in John the Baptist, who is prophesying Yahweh of the Old Testament's Messiah. So I'm sorry, Ivern. Once again, even the Gospel of John isn't going to save you. There's parts of the Gospel of John that are going to tie you back to Yahweh. So you're going to have to figure out what you want to do about that. As far as Luke in the Book of Acts, I personally don't think there's any good reason. Why would John was written in Greek? And there are people who disagree with you. There are people who say every time Jesus says "I am," he's using the Yahweh. None of the New Testament documents use the term Yahweh. Does Paul ever use the term Yahweh? I don't think so. When does Paul use the term Yahweh? I don't think he does, because all of these documents are written in Greek. They're not writing in Hebrew. What are you doing, Ivern? You need to think these things through.
Well, I would also
Anyways.
like to say that other people that are other Greek-speaking Jews, when they're talking about the God of the Old Testament, literally, like Josephus, for example, he's from the same time that the Gospels were written. He does refer to Yahweh by the divine name, and he spells it out: iota, alpha. Oh shoot, I can't think of the one for omega. Iota, alpha, omega, which is the Greek transliteration of the divine name Yahweh.
Okay, that's helpful information. But does Paul ever do that?
No, because in the New Testament they exclusively refer to Yahweh as Lord, because they don't say his name. They it's because during the first or the second temple period, it was illegal to mention Yahweh's name out loud, so they replaced his name with Kyrios, which just means Lord. And his name was only allowed to be spoken by the Jewish high priests in the temple once per year on the holiday Yom Kippur. They'd say his name in the temple out loud, and every other time throughout the year, you were only allowed to say Lord.
Okay.
I wish my grandfather was still alive. Now, he was the one, I think I was talking with you, Andy. He was the one that lived on Attica Road in Attica, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Greek. He was a Greek man. And he came over from Greece in, I don't know, he was born in 1888. Oh, wow. And he came over from Greece and he married my grandmother, who was a Texan. But he read that Bible from cover to cover. I swear to God, it's just, his favorite word was skazamos, which meant shut up, or shupim, which meant be quiet. But yeah, I mean, it's like, we have lost so much over history that we don't know. And I had a thought in mind and I completely lost it talking about my grandfather. But there's so many things that we don't know and understand that we're trying to put together in just fragments and pieces of information. And having conversations like this, it's really interesting. We don't know who we're talking to. I get on here and I'm like, oh, this guy knows me and he's been listening to me for a long time and blah, blah, blah. And, when you get into these deep conversations, it's like, well, Andy doesn't seem to believe that, the Bible is anything other than a fable. And, we have two people here on this chat right now that believe in the Bible.
Well, it's a little more complex. It's a little more complex than that. I do believe in lots of stuff in the Bible, like the wars, for example, that happened, and other historical accounts. But it's the things where Yahweh is speaking to people that I think is fictional.
Well, he didn't speak to everybody. And, and with the New Testament, it's like, all right, you have to be baptized before God really works and talks with you. And, he puts thoughts in your mind and this and that. And that's a little bit hard to explain to anybody, because it's like, oh, you're just talking to a ghost or something like that. But no, when things actually come to your mind for no reason at all, out of the clear blue sky.
Right down the toilet.
God
Anyhow,
darn it.
who was that? Anyhow,
Some clown.
Oh, anyhow, it's hard to explain. Nobody could understand it, and what is baptism all about? It's like God's spirit enters into our mind and our body when we are baptized, and he gives us all truth and understanding, which is like another element of the five senses, which you don't have. You only have five senses when you're a normal human being on the earth. But when you are baptized, you get an additional level of understanding that can only be met by the Holy Spirit. That's why I emphasize so much that.
No, that's not true. That's not. You don't get a sixth sense when you get baptized. That's nonsense. I'm not going to just let that fly. It's just there's no
Well,
evidence of that.
we could
Hold on,
argue about this.
lots of people. Well,
Anthony,
no,
we
there
could
lots of
argue
people get.
about this
Wait,
all
hold
day.
on. No, let's. All I'm saying is, lots of people have been baptized, and there's no evidence that they're smarter or more knowledgeable or more aware of the truth than anyone else. That's just ridiculous. You don't have to get baptized to be able to see truth.
I'm not saying that. This is not a criticism. It's just, to me, it's a reality, because I know the change in my mind, in my heart, when I was baptized. I went till I was 29, 30 years old. I was baptized just after my 30th birthday. And I did not have any stupid desire. I was raised in the church all my life. I hated it. I despised it. But one day it was like I got baptized, and my spirit changed within me 180 degrees, where I didn't want to read the Bible until I couldn't get enough of it. And it was an overnight experience. And it's like, you cannot deny that. I mean, if I were to deny that,
Yeah, I can. No, Nancy, I can, because that might have happened for you as one person,
but
there have literally been. Hold on, Nancy, let me speak. There have literally been billions of people who have been baptized in history, and a lot of them are really horrible, trash people. So there's just no evidence that being dunked in water does anything to regenerate a person or make them more susceptible to truth or anything like that.
Not all.
No, nobody.
You won't let me talk because you're becoming very defensive. Not all of them are really truly dunked in water and are baptized. It's just a ritual they go through. But I can only speak for myself, because I was one person one day, and the next day I was I wouldn't say I overcame all sin or anything like that, because it's a progressive type of thing, where God spoon feeds you information, and you grow and you grow and you grow. But I mean, it's not like, but I know you said you aren't baptized. You told me that how many times. And I don't want to get into a contest with you or anything like that. But I mean, it's not like you don't have any wisdom or knowledge or anything like that. But the Holy Spirit is something very real, that it changes a person from within, and it changes your heart, your soul, everything about you. Desire, all of a sudden your desire turns in a different direction toward God, in a different way that you can't even explain. And if I can't explain it to you, then people just, I reject it, and it's like, no, this can't possibly be true. And not every Christian that says that they're a Christian and was baptized is going to change, because it's just not possible. It's just, if you go through a ritual, just because you go through it doesn't mean anything. It's like,
even what I'm trying to say is,
anyhow,
even if you're very
I don't want to
sincere,
offend you or anybody else. But
no, you're not offending me.
This is
you're not
me.
offending me
This
at all,
is my testimony. This is my experience.
Right. And I'm sure there were a lot of people who never got
And
baptized,
hopefully there's
and they had
no
a
hard
similar
feelings
experience.
here.
No, there's not. There's no hard feelings at all. But I'm just, I hear people talk about baptismal regeneration. Yeah. Can you hear me? You might not be able to hear me. All right. I don't know. Something might be wrong with Nancy's.
Nancy, can you hear me?
There.
Did my phone go dead, or am I still here, or what happened?
Nancy, you might look at the, hopefully she can't even see the chat now that I think about it. Oh well. Yeah, I mean, people have been baptized from all different. There's Protestants who believe in baptism. There's Catholics who believe in baptism. There's Mormons who get baptized. People can get baptized from many different religious traditions. There are, you can be a part of a tradition that doesn't believe in baptism, like Buddhism, and have a significant change in your life. Things like that. So whether I'm not saying people, I've never said people shouldn't get baptized ever. It is a testament to their commitment to Christ. I think it's a good thing. But the idea that getting baptized somehow, enhances your ability to perceive truth or enhances your morality or anything like that, it really is nonsense in my opinion. But again, I don't want to discourage people from getting baptized as a sign or testament of their commitment to their convictions. I don't know. Can you hear me yet, Nancy? Are you still there? I think Nancy. I'm gonna. She used to be able to see the chat, so let me see. Here. All right, let's see if I can. She might have to. She might have to drop down and then pop up again. She might have to reset, or she might have muted. I don't know what's going on. Sometimes this stuff happens. Anyways, she also was talking about the book of Acts or the book of Luke. That is a really. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that of all the Gospels, the book of Luke is the one to be the question most. I mean, well, there are the skeptics who would question all of them, but Nancy's trying to join back. Nancy, can you hear us yet? All right, she's gone. I didn't boot her, but she was clearly having some sort of audio issues. Let's see here. I'm gonna leave that up. So maybe she'll see it and rejoin. If the New Testament was talking about Yahweh, they would have wrote Yahweh like the Dead Sea writers did. The New Testament was talking about a different God. I can't even imagine what it is a person in their lives, in their I'm trying to say things as nicely as I possibly can. I just don't understand how a person comes to this conclusion. Like what?
Yeah, I'm not sure. He's completely insane. He's making really big
Gotta
claims.
be
like the evidence for what he's saying is so weak. His whole point is that because they're not saying the divine name, that they're talking about a different God, even though they don't give the God any name. He automatically thinks it's a different God because they're not saying the divine name, even though we have tons of written records from all different sources that have Jews referring to God as Adonai or Kyrios if they're writing in Greek. But because there are some people that still use the divine name, like the Essenes, he thinks that they're talking about a different God, even though a majority of Jews are not using the divine name. So it's to be completely expected that's if you find a Jew saying Lord instead of, it's just silly. It's insane. Oh, his name is the Father. He thinks that the God's name is the Father. Yeah, that's not true at all. The majority of Jews are still using the divine name. That's just false. Almost all Jewish sources during that time period were saying Adonai or Kyrios if it's in Greek. Really the only thing you can even point to is the Dead Sea Scrolls, aside from like Josephus. Uh-oh, we lost Anthony. Oh, and Philo. Of course, rabbis are using the divine name. They're the ones that are allowed to use it. That's a silly example. Of course they're using it. They're the ones that are using it in the temple on Yom Kippur. Look how many examples there are of Jews not using the divine name and replacing it with Lord. And compare that and see how many there are. Because almost all Jewish writings from that time period that I've ever read don't say the divine name. They replace it with Lord. And you're like digging up a couple sources that use it and acting like it was normal. It wasn't. You're wrong. I mean, not to mention, we have writings from before the time of Jesus, like hundreds of years before Jesus's time, all leading up to Jesus's time, that identify the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as Yahweh, and including the actual text that Jesus and his apostles were reading from.